The gunshot echoed across the canyon before Samuel Hitch even realized his finger had pulled the trigger. 15 pairs of yellow eyes turned toward him, glowing in the dusk like lanterns from hell. The wolves didn't scatter. They didn't snarl. They just stood there, perfectly still, forming a circle around something small and pale in the tall grass. Samuel's horse whinnied and backed up 3 steps, but he held the reins tight, squinting through the fading light. That's when he saw her. A little girl, no more than 6 years old, sitting cross-legged in the center of that ring of wolves, her tiny hand resting on the massive gray head of the pack leader. She wasn't crying, wasn't trembling. She was humming, a soft, strange melody that made Samuel's skin prickle. The wolf beneath her hand tilted its head and looked straight at Samuel, lips pulling back just enough to show teeth. The girl stopped humming. She turned her face toward him, dirt-streaked and sunburned, eyes too calm for a child surrounded by predators. "Don't shoot them," she said, voice clear as a church bell. "They're taking me home. What I'm about to tell you today will leave you speechless. But first tell me, where are you listening from? I love knowing which corner of this country you're joining me from. Drop it in the comments, and if stories like this grab your soul, hit subscribe so I can bring you many more." Samuel Hitch had been riding for 3 days straight when he first heard the howling. It came from somewhere deep in Red Rock Canyon, a place most men avoided after sundown. The sound rose and fell like a hymn, each voice joining the next until the whole canyon seemed to vibrate with it. Samuel pulled his horse to a stop and listened, one hand instinctively moving to the rifle strapped to his saddle. He'd been tracking a stolen mare for a rancher in Silverton, following hoofprints that led him farther into the wilderness than he'd planned. Now the sun was dropping fast, painting the canyon walls the color of dried blood. The howling stopped as suddenly as it had started. Samuel waited, counting his own heartbeats in the silence. His horse stamped nervously, ears flat against its head. Something wasn't right. Wolves didn't usually gather in packs that large. Not in these parts. Not in late summer when game was plentiful. He dismounted slowly, keeping his movements quiet, and led his horse by the reins toward a cluster of rocks where he could get a better view of the canyon floor below. The air smelled different here, thick with sage and something else he couldn't name. When he reached the edge of the overlook, he saw them. 15 wolves, maybe more, moving in a tight circle about 200 yards down the slope. They weren't hunting. They weren't feeding. They were just walking slowly around something Samuel couldn't see from his position. He pulled out his spyglass and pressed it to his eye, adjusting the focus. That's when he saw the flash of pale fabric. Someone was down there. Someone small. His gut tightened. Samuel had seen plenty of death in his 42 years. He'd buried 2 brothers, a wife, and more friends than he cared to count. But the thought of finding a child torn apart by wolves made something cold settle in his chest. He tied his horse to a juniper tree, checked his rifle, and started down the rocky slope as quietly as he could manage. The stones shifted under his boots. He had to move sideways in some places, grabbing onto scrub brush to keep from sliding. By the time he reached the canyon floor, the light was almost gone. The wolves were closer now, maybe 60 yards away. Samuel crouched behind a boulder and watched. They were massive animals, bigger than any wolves he'd seen before, with thick gray coats and shoulders like bulls. The largest one, the pack leader by the look of it, stood at the center of the circle, and beneath its enormous head, sitting perfectly still in the dirt, was a little girl. She wore a torn blue dress, no shoes, and her hair hung in tangled brown knots past her shoulders. Samuel's breath caught. She was alive. He raised his rifle and aimed at the sky, firing a warning shot that cracked like thunder across the canyon. That's when everything changed. The wolves turned toward him, but they didn't charge. They didn't even growl. They just stood there watching him with those burning yellow eyes. The girl stopped humming and looked right at him, her face smudged with dirt and sunburn. She didn't look scared. She looked annoyed. "Don't shoot them," she said clearly. "They're taking me home." Samuel lowered the rifle slowly, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. A child surrounded by wolves, speaking to him like he'd interrupted her afternoon tea. He took 3 steps forward, keeping the rifle ready. "Little girl," he called out, voice rough from days without much talking. "You need to come with me. Right now. Those animals are dangerous." The girl shook her head. Her hand remained on the big wolf's head, fingers buried in its thick fur. The wolf's eyes never left Samuel's face. "They won't hurt me," the girl said. "They found me when I was lost. They gave me water." Samuel felt sweat trickle down his back despite the cooling air. This wasn't natural. Wolves didn't adopt lost children. They didn't stand guard like trained dogs. He'd heard stories, of course, old tales told around campfires about wild children raised by animals, but he'd never believed them. Those were just stories, weren't they? He took another step forward. The pack leader lifted its head and made a sound Samuel had never heard before. Not quite a growl, not quite a whine. It was something in between, something that made his skin crawl. The other wolves shifted, closing the circle tighter around the girl. Samuel stopped moving. "What's your name, child?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. The girl tilted her head, considering the question like it was something she hadn't thought about in a long time. "Emma," she finally said. "Emma Cartwright." Samuel's heart dropped into his stomach. Emma Cartwright, he knew that name. Everyone in 3 counties knew that name. Emma Cartwright had disappeared 4 months ago from her family's homestead near Copper Creek. She'd wandered away from her mother while they were hanging laundry, and by the time they realized she was gone, night had fallen. Search parties had combed the hills for weeks. They'd found nothing. No tracks, no torn clothing, no body. Her mother had died 2 months later, some said from a broken heart. Her father had vanished into a whiskey bottle. "Emma," Samuel said carefully, "your daddy's been looking for you. A lot of people have. We thought you were—" He didn't finish the sentence. The girl was staring at him with eyes that looked too old for her small face. "I was lost," she said simply. "The sun was hot. I couldn't find water. I fell down in the rocks and hurt my leg. That's when they found me." She gestured to the wolves around her. "The big one brought me a rabbit. The others took turns staying with me. They kept the mountain lions away." Samuel's mind raced. This was impossible. Wolves didn't do this. They didn't nurse wounded children. They didn't share their kills. But here she was, alive, sitting in the middle of a wolf pack like it was the most natural thing in the world. He looked at the big wolf again. Its eyes were intelligent, almost human. It watched Samuel with the kind of attention a man gives to something he's trying to understand. "Emma," Samuel said, "I need you to stand up real slow and walk toward me. Can you do that?" The girl looked down at the wolf beneath her hand. "I don't think they'll let me," she said. "They're taking me home, they told me." Samuel felt his patience starting to fray. "Wolves don't talk, child. They're animals. Dangerous animals. You've been out here too long. The sun's gotten to you. But you're safe now. I'm going to take you home." He took another step forward, and this time the pack leader snarled. It was a sound that made every muscle in Samuel's body tense. The other wolves began to move, spreading out, flanking him. Samuel raised his rifle again, but his hands were shaking. He'd never been afraid of wolves before. He'd shot his share over the years, protecting cattle and sheep. But this felt different. This felt like he was aiming at something that understood exactly what the rifle could do. "I don't want to hurt them," he said to Emma, "but I will if I have to. You need to come with me. Now." The girl stood up slowly. Her legs were scratched and bruised. She looked so small, so fragile. But when she spoke, her voice was firm. "They won't hurt you if you don't hurt them." The pack leader took a step toward Samuel, then another. Samuel's finger moved to the trigger. The wolf stopped just 10 feet away and sat down. It was the strangest thing Samuel had ever seen. The animal sat like a trained dog, tail curled around its haunches, head held high. The other wolves followed suit, all of them sitting in a perfect circle around Emma. The girl smiled for the first time. "See," she said, "they're good. They want to help me get home." Samuel lowered the rifle slightly, his mind spinning. This couldn't be real, but the evidence was right in front of him. A child who should be dead, alive and protected by a pack of wolves that behaved like nothing he'd ever seen. He thought about all the stories he'd dismissed over the years. Stories about animals that helped lost travelers. Stories about wolves that guided people through snowstorms. Stories about the land itself protecting those who respected it. Maybe there was more truth in those old tales than he'd wanted to believe. "All right," Samuel said slowly. "All right. I'm going to put the rifle down. But Emma, you need to listen to me. Your daddy's back in Copper Creek. He's been grieving for you. He thinks you're dead. We need to get you back to him." The girl's expression changed. Something dark passed over her small face. "My daddy?" she repeated, voice suddenly uncertain. Is he still drinking the bad water?" Samuel frowned. The bad water. That's what the children called whiskey. "I don't know, child, but he's your father. He has a right to see you." Emma looked down at her bare feet. "The wolves showed me things," she said quietly. "When I was sleeping, they showed me my house. I saw my daddy sitting on the porch. There was a bottle next to him, and he was crying." Samuel felt something twist in his chest. The girl had been gone 4 months, 4 months alone in the wilderness, and somehow she knew her father was still drowning in grief and drink. "Those were just dreams," he said gently, "but I'll help you get home. I promise." The big wolf stood up and walked over to Emma. It pressed its massive head against her side, nearly knocking her over. Emma wrapped her arms around its neck, burying her face in its fur. Samuel watched, rifle hanging loose in his hands. The other wolves began to move again, circling closer. But they weren't threatening. They were saying goodbye. One by one they came to Emma, touching their noses to her hands, her face, her hair. The girl was crying now, silent tears running down her dirty cheeks. "They have to go back to their pack," Emma whispered. "They have babies waiting. They can't leave them too long." Samuel didn't ask how she knew that. He was beyond asking questions. He just watched as the wolves finished their strange ritual and began to melt back into the shadows of the canyon. All except the big one. The pack leader stayed, standing between Emma and Samuel like a guardian. Emma wiped her face with the back of her hand. "He wants to make sure you're good," she said. "He wants to make sure you won't hurt me." Samuel slowly knelt down, setting the rifle on the ground beside him. He looked the wolf in the eye, something his father had always told him never to do, but he did it anyway. "I give you my word," Samuel said, feeling foolish talking to an animal. "I won't hurt her. I'll get her home safe." The wolf stared at him for a long moment. Then, incredibly, it dipped its head once, like a nod. It turned to Emma, touched its nose to her forehead, and then loped away into the darkness. Within seconds, it was gone. Emma stood alone in the canyon, small and shaking. Samuel got to his feet and walked over to her slowly. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She shook her head. "Just tired, and hungry. The wolves gave me food, but not much. They needed it for their babies." Samuel pulled off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. It swallowed her completely. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you up to my horse. It's going to be a long ride back." As they climbed up the rocky slope together, Emma stumbling on tired legs, Samuel kept replaying what he'd seen. The wolves sitting in a circle, the pack leader nodding, the way they'd touched Emma with something that looked like love. He'd been riding these territories for 20 years, and he thought he knew the land. He thought he understood the way things worked out here, but tonight, he'd seen something that changed everything, something that made him wonder what else he didn't know. When they reached his horse, Emma was almost asleep on her feet. Samuel lifted her onto the saddle and climbed up behind her, wrapping one arm around her small body to keep her steady. She leaned back against him, eyes already closing. "Mister?" she murmured. "Yes, child," Samuel replied. "Do you believe me? About the wolves?" Samuel looked back down into the dark canyon. Somewhere out there, 15 wolves were returning to their den, to their young, to their wildlife. And somewhere in that pack, one big gray wolf was probably watching them leave. "Yes," Samuel said quietly. "I believe you." They rode through the night, Samuel navigating by starlight and instinct. Emma slept against him, occasionally whimpering in her dreams. He wondered what she'd been through in those 4 months, what she'd seen, what she'd learned from those wolves. And he wondered if anyone back in Copper Creek would believe the truth when they heard it. Probably not. They'd say the girl had been traumatized, that she'd imagined the whole thing, that she'd simply gotten lucky and survived on her own. But Samuel knew what he'd seen. By dawn, they reached the outskirts of Copper Creek. The town was just waking up, smoke beginning to rise from chimneys. Samuel rode slowly down the main street, Emma still asleep in his arms. People stopped to stare, Mrs. Henderson dropped her wash basket. Old Jack Turner stumbled out of the saloon, still drunk from the night before, and rubbed his eyes like he was seeing a ghost. "Is that?" someone whispered. "Emma Cartwright," Samuel said loudly. "Alive! I found her in Red Rock Canyon." The commotion woke Emma. She opened her eyes and looked around at the gathering crowd. Samuel felt her body tense. "It's all right," he murmured. "You're home now. You're safe." But as he said the words, he realized he didn't know if they were true. This town, these people, this life she'd left behind 4 months ago, was it really home anymore? Or had home become something else? Something wild and strange and impossible to explain? Emma gripped his arm tightly. "Don't tell them about the wolves," she whispered. "They won't understand." Samuel nodded slowly. "I won't," he promised. "That'll be our secret." Someone ran to fetch Emma's father. Samuel dismounted and helped Emma down, keeping one hand on her shoulder. She looked so small standing there in the dusty street, wrapped in his too large coat, her bare feet pale against the dark earth. The crowd pressed closer, asking questions, reaching out to touch her like she was a miracle. And maybe she was. Maybe she was something the land had given back when it could have just as easily taken her forever. Then Emma's father appeared, pushing through the crowd. Samuel had seen him around town before, but barely recognized him now. John Cartwright looked like he'd aged 20 years. His face was gray. His clothes hung loose. His hands shook. He stopped a few feet away from Emma, staring at her like she might disappear if he moved. "Emma," he said, voice breaking. "Baby girl." Emma looked up at her father. For a moment, Samuel thought she might run to him, but she just stood there, studying him with those two old eyes. "Hi, Daddy," she said softly. John Cartwright dropped to his knees in the street and started to sob. Samuel watched as Emma slowly walked toward her father. She moved carefully, like someone approaching a wounded animal. When she reached him, John grabbed her and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight Samuel worried he might hurt her. The man was shaking all over, his sobs echoing down the empty street. Emma didn't hug him back. She just stood there, stiff and silent, her arms hanging at her sides. Her eyes found Samuel's over her father's shoulder. There was something in that look, something Samuel couldn't quite read. Fear? Sadness? Or something else entirely? The crowd pressed closer, everyone talking at once. Doc Winters pushed through, his medical bag in hand. "Let me see her, John. Let me make sure she's all right." John released Emma reluctantly, wiping his face with shaking hands. The doctor knelt down and started examining her, checking her eyes, her throat, her bruised legs. Emma endured it all quietly, answering his questions in short, simple words. Yes, she could see fine. No, nothing hurt too bad. Yes, she was thirsty. No, she didn't remember much. That last part was a lie, and Samuel knew it. Mrs. Henderson brought a blanket and a cup of water. Emma drank it all in 3 long gulps, then asked for more. Someone else brought bread and dried meat. The girl ate slowly, methodically, like someone who'd learned not to waste food. Samuel noticed how she kept glancing toward the edge of town, toward the hills beyond, looking for something, or someone. The wolves, he realized. She was looking for the wolves. He stepped closer to her, blocking her view of the crowd. "Emma," he said quietly, "remember what you promised me?" Emma looked up at him and nodded once. Doc Winters stood up, brushing dust off his knees. "She's dehydrated and undernourished, but otherwise she seems remarkably healthy. It's a miracle, truly." He turned to John. "Get her home, give her rest and food, and she should recover fully, though I'd like to check on her again in a few days." John nodded, not taking his eyes off his daughter. "Thank you, Doc. Thank you all." He looked around at the gathered crowd. "I don't know how she survived out there, but God brought her back to me. That's all that matters." Samuel felt Emma tense beside him. God didn't bring her back, he thought. The wolves did. But he kept his mouth shut. The crowd began to disperse, people heading back to their morning routines, already turning the story into something they could tell their grandchildren. The miracle of Emma Cartwright, the little girl who survived the wilderness alone. Samuel knew the truth would be twisted and reshaped until it fit what people wanted to believe. That's what always happened with uncomfortable truths. John reached for Emma's hand. "Come on, baby girl, let's get you home." Emma pulled her hand back. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but Samuel saw it. So did John. His face crumpled. "Emma," he said softly. "It's me. It's Daddy. I'm going to take care of you now. Everything's going to be all right." The girl looked at the ground. "Okay," she whispered, but she didn't sound convinced. She turned to Samuel one more time. "Thank you, mister," she said formally, like she was talking to a stranger. Samuel tipped his hat. "You're welcome, Miss Emma. You take care now." He watched them walk away together, John's hand hovering near Emma's shoulder but not quite touching her. The girl looked back once, and Samuel saw something in her expression that made his chest ache. She looked trapped, like a wild thing caught in a cage. He stood in the dusty street long after they disappeared around the corner, wondering if he'd done the right thing bringing her back, wondering if home was really where she belonged anymore. He needed a drink. Samuel led his horse to the livery stable, paid for boarding, and walked to the saloon. It was still early, but there were already a few men inside, nursing whiskey and talking in low voices. Samuel ordered a shot and downed it in one gulp. The bartender, a thick-necked man named Pete, leaned across the bar. That was something, wasn't it? That Cartwright girl just walking out of the wilderness like nothing happened. Samuel set his glass down. "She didn't walk out. I found her, and plenty happened." Pete refilled the glass without being asked. "Word is you found her in Red Rock Canyon. That's rough country. What was she doing all the way out there?" Samuel considered his answer carefully. Lost, scared, doing her best to survive. It wasn't a lie, just not the whole truth. Pete shook his head in wonder. 4 months. A little girl, alone for 4 months. It's impossible. Samuel lifted his glass. And yet, here we are. He drank the second shot slower, letting it burn down his throat. The saloon doors swung open and Sheriff Tom Brennan walked in. The sheriff was a big man with a thick mustache and eyes that missed nothing. He spotted Samuel immediately and walked over. "Samuel Hitch. Heard you're the hero of the hour." Samuel grimaced. "Wouldn't say that. Just found a lost girl and brought her home." Brennan ordered coffee and sat on the stool next to Samuel. "Mind telling me the whole story? I need to make a report. John Cartwright's going to want to know everything about where his daughter's been." Samuel told him the story, leaving out the part about the wolves protecting her. He said he'd heard Emma calling for help, that he'd found her sheltering in some rocks, alone and frightened. It was close enough to the truth. Brennan listened carefully, sipping his coffee. When Samuel finished, the sheriff was quiet for a long moment. "You didn't see any sign of what she'd been eating? Where she'd been staying?" Samuel shook his head. "Canyons full of caves and crevices. Could have been anywhere. As for food, there's game out there. Maybe she found water, ate berries, caught fish." Brennan didn't look convinced. A 6-year-old girl catching fish and finding berries for 4 months? In that terrain? Samuel met his gaze steadily. "She's alive, Tom. That's what matters. Maybe she got lucky. Maybe the good Lord was watching over her. Either way, she's home now." The sheriff studied him for another moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, I'll put that in my report. Though between you and me, something about this doesn't add up, but I suppose we'll never know the full story." "You're right about that," Samuel thought. He finished his drink and stood up. "I should get some rest. Been riding for 3 days straight." Brennan put a hand on his arm. "One more thing. Did the girl say anything about how she survived? Anything at all?" Samuel thought about Emma whispering, "Don't tell them about the wolves. She said she was scared and alone. That's all. She's just a child, Tom. A traumatized child. Let her be." The sheriff released his arm and nodded. "Fair enough. Good work, Samuel. John Cartwright owes you his life." Samuel left the saloon and walked to the boarding house where he kept a room. His whole body ached with exhaustion. He climbed the stairs slowly, unlocked his door, and collapsed onto the narrow bed without even taking off his boots. But sleep wouldn't come. He kept seeing Emma's face, the way she'd stood so still among those wolves, the way she'd looked at her father with those distant, wary eyes, the way she'd glanced back at the hills, searching. What had those 4 months in the wilderness done to her? And what would coming back do to her now? He must have dozed off eventually, because he woke to pounding on his door. The sun was setting, casting orange light through his window. Samuel sat up, groggy and disoriented. "Who is it?" he called. "Doc Winters." I need to talk to you. Samuel opened the door. The doctor looked troubled, his usual calm demeanor replaced by worry. Can I come in? Samuel stepped aside. Doc Winters entered and closed the door behind him. He paced the small room twice before speaking. I examined Emma more thoroughly this afternoon, at the house, and Samuel, something's not right. Samuel's stomach dropped. Is she hurt? Sick? The doctor shook his head. No, that's just it, she's too healthy. Her skin should be burned raw from sun exposure. It's not. Her feet should be torn to ribbons from walking barefoot. They're calloused but healed. She should be covered in insect bites, scratches, infected wounds. She has some old scars, yes, but nothing fresh. Nothing that suggests she spent 4 months struggling to survive in the wilderness. Doc Winters sat heavily on the room's single chair. And there's something else, her teeth. They're cleaner than when she disappeared. Samuel felt cold sweat on his back. What are you saying, Doc? Winters looked at him intently. I'm saying that girl wasn't suffering out there. She was thriving. Someone or something was taking care of her, feeding her, protecting her, keeping her clean. He paused. You found her, Samuel. What did you really see out there? Samuel walked to the window and looked out at the darkening street. He could lie again, should lie again. But Doc Winters was a good man, and if something was truly wrong with Emma, he needed to know. I saw wolves, Samuel said quietly. A whole pack of them, surrounding her, protecting her. He turned to face the doctor. They weren't hunting her, Doc. They were taking care of her. I saw it with my own eyes, saw them touch her gently, saw them say goodbye to her when I took her away. And I know how that sounds. I know what you must be thinking. Doc Winters didn't laugh or scoff. He just stared at Samuel with wide eyes. Wolves don't do that, he said softly. It's not possible. I know, Samuel replied, but I saw it anyway. They sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, Doc Winters spoke again. There are stories, old Indian stories about children being raised by animals. Wolf children, bear children. The tribes used to say that sometimes the land itself decides to protect someone, that the animals act as guardians for those who are pure of heart. He rubbed his face tiredly. I always thought they were just legends, myths to explain things people couldn't understand. Samuel sat on the edge of his bed. Maybe some legends are true. Doc Winters nodded slowly. The question is, what do we do now? Do we tell people? John has a right to know where his daughter was, what kept her alive. Samuel thought about the crowd that morning, about how they'd react if they knew wolves had raised Emma Cartwright. They'd call it devil's work. They'd say she was cursed. They'd look at her like she was something unnatural. Or worse, they'd form hunting parties and try to track down the pack that saved her, kill them out of fear. We tell no one, Samuel said firmly. Emma asked me to keep it secret. She knew what would happen if people found out. She's smart, that girl. Smarter than most adults I know. Doc Winters was quiet for a long time. Then he stood up and walked to the door. All right, I'll keep your secret. But Samuel, watch over that girl if you can. Something tells me she's going to need a friend who understands what she's been through. Her father's not in good shape. The drinking, the grief, it's hollowed him out. I'm not sure he can give her what she needs. After the doctor left, Samuel lay back on his bed and stared at the ceiling. He thought about John Cartwright, broken and drowning in whiskey. He thought about Emma, standing stiff in her father's arms. He thought about that big gray wolf dipping its head like a promise before it disappeared into the darkness. And he wondered what would happen when the two worlds collided. The world Emma had left behind, and the world she'd learned to live in. Could a child who'd run with wolves ever truly come home? 3 days passed. Samuel spent them in town, recovering from his long ride and handling business. He sold the stolen mare he'd been tracking back to its rightful owner. He collected his payment and restocked his supplies, and he kept an ear out for news about Emma Cartwright. What he heard troubled him. The girl barely spoke, people said. She refused to sleep in her bed, preferring to curl up on the floor by the window. She wouldn't eat cooked meat, only wanting it raw or barely seared. She kept trying to leave the house, heading for the hills. John Cartwright was struggling. Samuel heard it from Mrs. Henderson, who'd been bringing meals to their house. That poor man doesn't know what to do, she told Samuel at the general store. The girl won't talk to him, won't let him touch her. She just sits by that window all day and night staring out at the wilderness. It's like she's waiting for something. Samuel knew what she was waiting for. She was waiting for the wolves to come back for her. She was waiting to go home. On the fourth day, Samuel couldn't stand it anymore. He bought a bag of hard candy and walked to the Cartwright house. It was a small cabin on the edge of town, with a sagging porch and peeling paint. Samuel knocked. John answered, looking worse than he had 4 days ago. His eyes were bloodshot, his clothes rumpled. The smell of whiskey rolled off him in waves. "Samuel," he said, surprise in his voice. "Didn't expect to see you again." Samuel held up the candy. "Thought Emma might like these, mind if I come in?" John hesitated, then stepped aside. The inside of the cabin was dim and musty. Dishes were piled in the wash basin. Clothes lay scattered on the floor. Samuel's heart sank. This was no place for a child to heal. Emma sat on the floor by the window, just as Mrs. Henderson had described. She was wearing a clean dress, but her feet were still bare. Her hair had been washed and braided, but she'd already pulled half of it loose. She looked up when Samuel entered, and her whole face changed. Relief flooded her features. "Mr. Samuel," she said, the first genuine emotion he'd heard in her voice since they'd arrived in town. Samuel knelt down beside her and offered the candy. "Thought you might be getting tired of Mrs. Henderson's cooking." Emma took a piece and put it in her mouth, eyes widening at the sweetness. "Thank you," she whispered. Then, so quietly that only Samuel could hear, "Can you take me back?" Samuel's chest tightened. He glanced at John, who was pouring himself a drink in the kitchen, not paying attention. "Back where, Emma?" he asked, though he already knew. "To them, to my family." The words hit Samuel like a punch. "Your family." She didn't mean John, she meant the wolves. "Emma," he said gently, "your father needs you. He's been mourning you. He loves you." The girl looked at him with those two old eyes. "He loves the girl I used to be. But I'm different now. I don't fit here anymore. The walls are too close. The sounds are too loud. And he smells wrong. Everything smells wrong." She pressed her face against the window glass. "Out there, I knew what to do. I knew where I belonged. Here, I'm just lost in a different way." Samuel didn't know what to say. How could he explain to a 6-year-old that she had to stay in a world that felt wrong? How could he tell her that the wild wasn't where children belonged, even if that's where she felt most alive? He looked at her small face pressed against the glass, at the longing in her eyes, and something broke inside him. She was right. She didn't belong here. Not anymore. Maybe not ever again. "Give it time," he said weakly. "Give your father a chance. Give this place a chance." Emma turned away from the window and looked directly at him. "How much time did you give it?" she asked. "Before you left your home and started riding the wilderness?" Samuel froze. The girl saw too much. Understood too much. "That's different," he said. "I'm a grown man. You're a child." Emma shook her head. "I'm not a child anymore. Children don't survive 4 months in Red Rock Canyon. Children don't learn to howl at the moon and hunt in packs. I'm something else now. Something in between." She touched his hand. "You understand. I can see it. You're in between too." Samuel stayed at the Cartwright house for an hour, sitting with Emma while John drank himself into a stupor in the kitchen. Emma told him things she wouldn't tell anyone else, about how the wolves had found her that first night, when she was crying and alone, and sure she was going to die. About how the big gray one, the pack leader, had laid down beside her and kept her warm. About how they'd brought her food and water and taught her to move quietly through the brush. About how she'd learned their language, not words but feelings and intentions communicated through sounds and gestures and touch. She told him about running with them under the stars, about sleeping in a pile of warm fur, about learning to track rabbits and recognize the signs of danger, about feeling like she was part of something bigger than herself, something wild and free and ancient. And she told him about the day they'd decided to bring her home, how the pack leader had shown her visions of her father, broken and grieving, how they'd walked with her for 2 days, guiding her toward the place where humans lived, how they'd surrounded her one last time, protecting her until someone found her. "They loved me," Emma said simply, "not because I was their daughter or because they had to, but because I was part of their pack, and out there in the wilderness, that's what matters, not blood, not houses or towns or rules, just the pack, just belonging." Samuel felt tears prick his eyes. He understood more than he wanted to. He'd been alone for so long, drifting from town to town, never settling, never belonging. Maybe that's why the wolves had let him take Emma. Maybe they'd recognized something in him. Another creature caught between two worlds. When he finally stood to leave, Emma grabbed his hand. "Will you come back?" she asked. "Will you check on me?" Samuel nodded. "I will. I promise." He walked to the kitchen where John had passed out at the table, head on his arms, an empty bottle beside him. Samuel felt disgust and pity in equal measure. This was the man Emma was supposed to trust. This broken drunk who couldn't even stay sober long enough to care for his miracle daughter. He left the cabin and walked back toward town, his mind churning. That night, Samuel lay awake in his room at the boarding house. He kept thinking about what Emma had said, about being something in between, about not belonging. He thought about John Cartwright, drowning in grief and alcohol. He thought about the wolves, wild and free in the canyon. And he thought about what was right, not what people expected, not what society demanded, but what was truly right for one small girl who'd learned to howl at the moon. By the time the sun rose, Samuel had made a decision. It was probably the wrong one. It would certainly be the dangerous one, but it felt like the only choice that made sense. He got up, packed his saddlebags, and went to the livery stable. He saddled his horse and checked his rifle. Then he rode to the Cartwright cabin. It was early, just past dawn. John was probably still sleeping off last night's whiskey. Samuel tied his horse at the fence and walked to the door. He knocked once, twice. No answer. He tried the handle. Unlocked. He stepped inside. The cabin was dark and quiet. John was passed out in his bed, snoring loudly. And Emma sat by the window, exactly where she'd been yesterday, waiting. She turned when she heard Samuel enter. "You came back," she said. There was hope in her voice. Samuel knelt down beside her. "Emma, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Do you want to stay here? With your father? In this town?" Emma looked at him for a long moment. Then she shook her head. "I want to go back," she whispered. "I want to go home, to my real home." Samuel took a deep breath. "Then get your coat, we're leaving." What would you do if a child asked you to take them away from everything they'd ever known? Think about it while we continue. Emma didn't hesitate. She stood up, grabbed Samuel's coat that she'd kept folded beside her, and walked to the door. Samuel glanced back at John's bedroom. The man was still snoring, dead to the world. They could be miles away before he even woke up. Samuel's heart hammered in his chest. What he was about to do could get him hanged. Taking a child from her father, even a drunk father, was kidnapping. But looking at Emma's face, seeing the desperate hope there, he couldn't turn back now. They stepped out into the cool morning air and closed the door quietly behind them. Samuel lifted Emma onto his horse and climbed up behind her. She settled against him like she'd done it 100 times. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Red Rock Canyon," Samuel replied. "Back to where I found you. Back to your pack." Emma's whole body relaxed. For the first time since they'd returned to town, she looked peaceful. They rode out slowly, trying not to draw attention. But Mrs. Henderson was already up, sweeping her porch. She saw them and waved. Samuel waved back, keeping his expression casual. Just taking the girl for a morning ride. Nothing to worry about. Once they cleared the town limits, Samuel urged his horse into a faster pace. They needed distance. When John woke up and found Emma gone, he'd come looking. So would Sheriff Brennan. Samuel would be branded an outlaw, a child thief. Everything he'd built over the years, his reputation as an honest tracker, would be destroyed. But somehow that didn't matter as much as the small girl sitting in front of him, humming that strange melody she'd hummed the first night he'd found her. The wolf song. She was calling them, telling them she was coming home. They rode hard for 3 hours, stopping only to water the horse. Emma barely spoke, just kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, watching for the red cliffs of the canyon. Samuel's mind raced with doubts. Was he doing the right thing? Could a child really survive long-term with wolves? What if they rejected her this time? What if they'd only tolerated her before because she was helpless? Now she'd been back with humans. She smelled different. She might not be Pack anymore. But every time doubt crept in, he remembered her face pressed against that window. Remembered her saying, "I'm just lost in a different way." When they reached the canyon rim, the sun was high overhead. Samuel dismounted and helped Emma down. She stood at the edge, looking down into the rocky depths where shadows pooled like dark water. "Are you sure about this?" Samuel asked her. "Once we do this, there's no going back. Your father will think you're dead. The whole town will think you're dead. You'll be giving up everything." Emma turned to look at him. "I already gave it up," she said simply. "4 months ago when I walked into the wilderness. I just didn't know it yet." Samuel pulled his rifle from its saddle holster and checked the ammunition. Not because he planned to shoot anything, but because the wilderness demanded respect. "I'll take you down to where I found you," he said. "We'll wait there. See if they come." Emma nodded. They started down the slope together, Samuel going first to test the footing, Emma following with the sure-footedness of someone who'd learned to climb in rougher terrain. Rocks skittered under their boots. A hawk circled overhead, crying out. The air smelled of sage and sun-baked stone. When they reached the canyon floor, Emma ran ahead. She went straight to the spot where Samuel had first seen her, surrounded by wolves. She knelt in the dirt and put both hands flat against the ground. Samuel watched her, this strange small girl who belonged more to the wild than to civilization. She closed her eyes and tilted her head back. Then she began to howl. It was a sound that made Samuel's hair stand on end. Not a human sound trying to imitate a wolf, but a wolf's howl coming from a human throat. Long, mournful, and achingly beautiful. It echoed off the canyon walls and rolled out across the wilderness. They waited. 5 minutes. 10. 15. Samuel's hope began to fade. Maybe the pack had moved on. Maybe they'd forgotten her. Maybe this whole desperate plan was just that. Desperate and foolish. Emma howled again, a different tone this time. More urgent, more pleading. Samuel's chest ached. What had he done? He'd taken her from her father, ridden her out into the middle of nowhere, and now they were alone. He was about to suggest they head back, try to fix this somehow, when Emma went completely still. "They're here," she whispered. Samuel turned slowly. At first he saw nothing, just rocks and shadows and scrub brush. Then the shadows moved. One by one, wolves emerged from behind boulders, from between crevices, from the very air it seemed. 5, 10, 15, the whole pack. And leading them was the big gray, the pack leader, its yellow eyes fixed on Emma. The wolf approached slowly, cautiously. It was testing her, making sure she was who it thought she was. Emma didn't move. She just knelt there, hands still pressed to the ground, head slightly bowed, submissive, respectful, showing she remembered the rules. The pack leader reached her and sniffed her hair, her face, her hands. It circled her once, twice, 3 times. The other wolves watched, tense and alert. This was the moment of decision. Would they accept her back, or would they see her as an intruder now, tainted by human contact? Samuel held his breath. The big gray stopped in front of Emma and stared into her eyes. Then slowly, deliberately, it lowered its massive head and touched its nose to her forehead. The same gesture it had made the night Samuel took her away. Recognition, acceptance, welcome home. Emma threw her arms around the wolf's neck and buried her face in its fur. She was crying, but not sad tears, relief tears, joy tears. The other wolves pressed closer, touching her with their noses, their paws, making soft whining sounds. They were greeting her, celebrating her return. Samuel watched with tears running down his own face. He'd never seen anything like it, never imagined anything like it. This was beyond nature as he understood it. This was something else entirely, something sacred. He knew in that moment that he'd made the right choice. This was where Emma belonged. But they weren't safe yet. Samuel knew that even as he watched the reunion. By now John would be awake. He'd find Emma gone. He'd raise an alarm. Sheriff Brennan would organize a search party. They'd track Samuel's horse prints straight to this canyon. He had maybe 2 hours, probably less. He needed to cover their tracks. Make it look like Emma had run away on her own. Make it look like she died out here. It was the only way to protect her, the only way to let her truly stay. He walked over to where Emma sat surrounded by wolves. "Emma," he said gently. The girl looked up, her face radiant. "Emma, I need you to listen carefully. People are going to come looking for you. Your father, the sheriff, probably half the town. We need to make them think you're gone for good, that you died out here." Emma's expression grew serious. She understood. "What do we do?" she asked. Samuel thought quickly. "Your dress, take it off." Emma stood and unbuttoned the clean dress Mrs. Henderson had given her. Underneath, she wore a simple cotton shift. Samuel took the dress and walked to the far side of the canyon, where a steep drop-off led to a rocky ravine below. He climbed down carefully, the wolves watching his every move. About 20 feet down, he found what he was looking for, a jagged outcrop of rocks sharp as knives. He tore the dress in several places and rubbed dirt into it. Then he smeared some of his own blood on it, cutting his palm on the sharp rocks. Not much, just enough to make it convincing. He wedged the torn dress into the rocks where it would be visible from above but hard to reach. It would tell a story. A little girl climbing down, losing her footing, falling. The dress catching on the rocks as she tumbled into the ravine below. When Samuel climbed back up, Emma was already looking different. She'd torn the sleeves off her shift and tied her hair back with a strip of cloth. She looked less like a civilized child and more like a wild thing. The wolves stood close to her, a living barrier between her and the human world. "I need to go," Samuel said. "I need to lead them away from here. Make them believe the story." Emma nodded. She walked over to him and took his hand. "Thank you," she said, "for understanding, for letting me choose." Samuel squeezed her small hand. "You take care of yourself. Stay smart. Stay hidden. And Emma, be happy." She smiled at him. A real smile this time. Not the forced one she'd worn in town. "I will be." "I already am." Samuel turned to the pack leader. The big gray wolf watched him with those intelligent eyes. "You keep her safe," Samuel said. "You hear me? You keep her safe or I'll come back here and hunt down every last one of you." He meant it. The wolf seemed to understand. It dipped its head once, that same gesture of acknowledgement. Then Samuel turned and climbed back up to where his horse waited. He mounted up and looked down one last time. Emma stood in the center of the wolf pack, already looking like she'd never left, like she'd always belonged there, like she was home. Samuel rode hard back toward Copper Creek. His heart felt like it was being torn in two. Relief and grief warred inside him. He'd saved Emma from a life of misery with a drunk father in a town that would never understand her. But he'd also just made himself a criminal. He'd taken a child from her legal guardian and left her in the wilderness with wolves. If anyone found out the truth, he'd hang. But the truth would die with him. He'd make sure of it. He rode into town just as the sun was starting to set. The main street was in chaos. People running everywhere, horses being saddled, men loading rifles. Sheriff Brennan saw him first. "Samuel, thank God, John Cartwright's girl is missing. Says she was there this morning and now she's gone. You seen her?" Samuel made his face show exactly the right amount of shock and concern. "Emma's missing?" "No, I haven't seen her." "When did John notice?" Brennan's jaw was tight. "About 2 hours ago. He woke up and she wasn't by the window like usual. Thought maybe she was outside, but there's no sign of her anywhere. We're organizing search parties." Samuel dismounted quickly. "I'll join you. I know that terrain better than anyone." They searched for 3 days. Samuel made sure he was in the group that explored Red Rock Canyon. He's the one who found the torn dress wedged in the rocks. He called the others over, his voice shaking convincingly. "Here, I found something." The men gathered around, staring down at the ravine, at the torn blue fabric stained with blood, at the impossible distance to the bottom. Sheriff Brennan's face went gray. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered. "She fell. The poor little thing climbed down here and fell." They searched the ravine below for a body but found nothing. The explanation was simple enough, Samuel suggested. Wild animals, scavengers. 4 days was more than enough time. John Cartwright had to be physically restrained when they told him. He screamed that it was impossible, that Emma couldn't be dead, that she'd just been found alive. But the evidence was undeniable. The dress, the blood, the ravine. Doc Winters sedated him and took him home. The town held a funeral with an empty coffin. They buried it next to Emma's mother. People wept and prayed and said it was God's will, that Emma had been returned just long enough for her father to see her one last time, that now she was with her mother in heaven. Samuel stood in the back of the church, hat in his hands, and said nothing. After the funeral, Sheriff Brennan pulled Samuel aside. "You all right? You look troubled." Samuel forced himself to meet the sheriff's eyes. "Just thinking about what that poor girl must have gone through. Surviving 4 months only to die like that. Seems cruel." Brennan nodded. "It does, but maybe it was meant to be. Maybe she was never supposed to come back in the first place." He clapped Samuel on the shoulder. "You did good work finding her. Gave John a few days with his daughter before the end. That's worth something." Samuel nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He left Copper Creek the next morning. Couldn't bear to stay. Couldn't bear to watch John Cartwright drink himself to death over a daughter who wasn't actually dead. Couldn't bear the weight of his secret. He rode north, taking jobs where he could find them, always moving. But every few months he'd swing back through the territories near Red Rock Canyon. He never went into the canyon itself. That was Emma's home now, and he wouldn't intrude. But sometimes, on clear nights when the moon was full, he'd camp on the rim, and he'd listen. Listening for the sound of wolves howling in the darkness. Listening for one particular voice among them, higher and sweeter than the rest. A child's voice that had learned to speak in the language of the wild. Months passed. A year. Samuel heard through the grapevine that John Cartwright had died. Liver gave out from all the drinking. They buried him next to the empty grave of his daughter. Samuel said a prayer for the man, even though he'd helped destroy him. John had never been a bad father before Emma disappeared. The grief had broken him, and Samuel's decision to return Emma to the wolves had finished the job. He carried that guilt like a stone in his chest. But when he thought about Emma trapped in that cabin, staring out the window, dying slowly inside, he knew he'd make the same choice again. 3 years after he'd left Emma in the canyon, Samuel was tracking a horse thief through the Badlands when he saw something that made him pull up short. Tracks in the dust. Small, bare footprints running alongside wolf prints. Lots of wolf prints. He followed them for a mile, his heart pounding. The tracks led to a rocky outcrop where someone had made camp. There were the remains of a fire, bones from a rabbit, and scratched into the rock face, crude but unmistakable, was a drawing. A man on a horse, a little girl, and a pack of wolves. Underneath, in shaky letters that looked like they'd been made by someone just learning to write again, were 2 words. "Thank you." Samuel touched the letters with shaking fingers. She was alive. Not just alive, but thriving. Learning, growing. Still part of her pack, still running free. He looked out across the wilderness, seeing it differently now. Not as a harsh and deadly place, but as a home for those who didn't fit anywhere else. A sanctuary for the wild-hearted. He pulled out his knife and carved his own message below Emma's. Just 3 words. "Be happy, Emma." Then he mounted his horse and rode away, knowing he'd probably never see her again, but knowing too that she was exactly where she needed to be. Years later, Samuel heard stories from trappers and traders. Stories about a wild girl who ran with wolves in Red Rock Canyon. Stories about a pack that was bigger and smarter than any pack had a right to be. Stories about how that pack never attacked humans, never took livestock, just vanished like smoke whenever people got too close. Some folks said it was a legend, a campfire tale, but Samuel knew better. He knew the truth. And sometimes when he was very old and sitting by a fire telling stories to whoever would listen, he'd tell them about the miracle of Emma Cartwright, how she'd survived 4 months in the wilderness and come back changed, how she'd died in a fall just days after being found. But he never told them the real ending, never told them about taking her back, about watching her choose the wolves over civilization, about the tracks and the message scratched into stone. That secret stayed locked in his heart until the day he died. And maybe that was how it should be. Some miracles weren't meant to be explained or understood. Some miracles were just meant to be. Out in Red Rock Canyon, the wolves still howled at the moon. And among them, if you listened very carefully, you could hear one voice that was different from the rest. Higher, sweeter, almost human, but not quite. Something in between. Something wild and free and utterly, completely home. The pack still runs in those canyons today, or so the old-timers say. And sometimes hikers report seeing a woman with tangled hair and sun-dark skin, running barefoot through the rocks with wolves at her side. They think their eyes are playing tricks on them. They think the heat has gotten to them. But maybe they're seeing Emma Cartwright, all grown up, still living the life she chose, still running with her pack, still howling at the stars. And maybe, just maybe, Samuel Hitch's gamble paid off. Maybe letting her go was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for her, not forcing her to fit into a world that would never understand her, but letting her be exactly what she was, wild, free, and finally, truly home. Sometimes the hardest choices we make are the ones that look wrong to everyone else but feel right in our hearts. What would you have done in Samuel's place? Would you have brought Emma back to her father, or let her return to the wolves? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story touched something deep in your soul, subscribe for more true tales from the wild frontier. Because out here, where civilization meets wilderness, sometimes the most impossible stories turn out to be the truest ones of all.